just waiting for you to do, to do, to do, to do,
I've been wearing Sperry boat shoes since I was a kid, and my dad did too. Whenever we would fish, my pops was always in his Sperry's, and so was I. They have the best boat shoes on the planet. There's really no competition. So use our exclusive code BFC20 to shop now and get 20% off your purchase of $99 or more. Offer is valid till September 1st. Again, that code is BFC20. Go check them out. How about we start with that 51-inch striper on the fly that you just got recently?
Yeah, that was I don't get to fish much or whatever, but I was looking for these big fish that move up and down the coast and stuff, and it was funny because the day before, the guy that I had had the worst day of flats fishing. And it's not that we didn't have fish, but he was rusty, his cast was bad, and he couldn't see the fish. And so the next day, I had him for 2 days, and so the next day he's like, God, I'm so bummed about yesterday. I can't believe how bad I did. And I turned around and said, oh, don't worry, today's a new day. So we went from flats fishing, and then I took my big boat and we went out, and I said, look, let's go on a little adventure, see if we can find these big fish. Well, and it was a beautiful day, which made it ideal conditions to do it. So we went out and looked for them, and about 3 hours in, I was ready to oh God, I'm sorry, man. It just, and then I saw, a couple of birds, and I said, something, they're looking at something. So take that plug over there and just throw it. So he throws the plug, and I'm looking at the birds, and he starts screaming, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, look at it. And there's this monster bass following the plug. So I said, okay, this is them. So, finally, after hours looking for. So anyway, so we tried all sorts of different things, and his cast was a little weak, and the fish were around the boat, but we couldn't feed him, and I'm like, God, try this, try. So after about, 45 minutes of doing that, I said, look it, man, I gotta fish. I gotta, get this stripped down and figure out what they're doing and everything. And so he said, please, because he hadn't hooked a fish yet. They're swimming around the boat. So I, take a cast, and I'm stripping. I'm trying to figure it out, and I'm trying to come on, what do you do? And on the second cast, I turn around to him just as I get it in, and I said, well, I don't, and the line comes tight, and it's like, that's it. It's you got to pause a long time. So anyway, we never realized how big the fish was. We didn't see it. It was right next to the boat. So it takes off, and for the next 10 minutes, after I've, finally cleared the line and everything, it's like, dude, this is a big fish, so we had no idea when we pulled it up. It was like, holy Jesus, the guy's like, I've never seen a bigger fish. Oh my God. Oh, and he's like, I want to land it. So I said, okay, it's a double lipper though. He sticks one thumb in, and I said, no, you need two. And he couldn't even lift it, so we both grab it and, put it in the boat. And then it was like, Jesus Christ, look at that thing. And I don't like boga gripping him too much or whatever, but I had a tape, so I just measured him. He was long and skinny. He was 51 inches. And I may have caught bigger ones weight wise, but the length of them anyway. So yeah, it was a fish of a lifetime. So we quickly released him, and then after we figured that out, then it was game on, and he bailed him. So we had a great day. It was really fun.
Isn't that amazing how things can just take a change like that so quickly? You could go for hours and just be ready to throw in the towel, and then all of a sudden it's on.
Yeah, it's it was lucky in a sense, but in the same time, it was like all the elements coming together, and it's the fish do certain things at certain times of the year and everything, and this is one of those times. If you can find these, these big, there's like a couple of year classes of fish, and these big ones that everybody gets, those fish are 20 something years old. They're back in the heyday of when you had the huge spawning classes, and so, you just got to find them, but it's, but that's half the fun. The whole fun is, especially by us, it's, by the city and by New Jersey and where they're dropping out of rivers and where they're concentrated on, bunker and stuff, it's, you have a better concentration of bigger fish. It's probably easier. Once they start traveling, then it's like, okay, where are you guys going? And there's certain areas that they like to frequent or they'll pass through. And, so you just, you hope you get lucky, and that was one lucky day.
Definitely. Sounds like it.
Yeah, it's fun.
Considering the state of the striped bass fishery right now and everything that's going on, I've heard conflicting sides to the whole argument of whether or not they're doing well, whether or not they're doing worse. I mean, what are you seeing out there?
Well, it's actually been a spring that's almost mind-boggling because there's fish all up and down the coast, and everybody seems to have a share of fish of of different sizes and everything. So, it's like great. It looks good. But my thoughts are this, and the last few years have sort of told you this, but the there's a ton of there's a group of really big fish that were those spawning classes that I were talking about. And those are all 30 to 60 pounds. There's some monsters. So there's a couple of year classes from way back in when the spawning was good, and they're just older fish. And then Mother Nature dealt you a blow. And if you look at the charts that they keep track of, the spawning for 50 years, they say in the Chesapeake, and they could tell you the young of the year index. So you went through a period of 2000, to 2001, 2007, 8, whatever it was, where the spawning wasn't great. I forget what years, but it was really down and really bad. So then in 15, you have, a big spawning year. So you got a group of really large fish, and then you have some in between, and you got a really good group of small fish, that we've been watching, for a while there. I don't know, maybe 7 years ago, for the first time in Montauk, the blitzes didn't happen. And then you had finally the 2015 year class showed, and the blitzes are back on, So those fish now are, like last year were, 26, 27, and there's hordes of them, a lot of them, Well, those fish are now falling into the slot, so you got a pretty good body of fish. But it's, there's a lot of keepers out there. Everybody's like, wow, we got a ton of keepers. Well, the problem is that those keepers are going to whittle down, so because of the take. And the science sort of tells us that even with the restrictions and the slot limit and what they put on, trying to save it, which, for years we've been begging them, do something. Well, even that, they give a 50-50 chance of working. So the thing that I'm worried about, because everything looks rosy, and we all, even now, I've never seen a spring like this in Montauk. It's been really good, but the problem being is a lot of fish are coming into that slot limit, and there's a lot of slot fish out there, and there's a lot of killing again. So you're seeing, that's the regulations, and people could do it, but the head boats are stacking them like cordwood at the docks, and everybody out there is oh, it's a keeper. I see every day, and people are conscious, they're measuring and everything else, and I got nothing like I said about keeping fish, but that being said, I don't know that in the long run, if it's really going to work out that great, because you see this great population of fish, but there's so many that are in that slot limit, and there's so many people fishing for them. 2 days ago, I mean, Montauk looked like a parking lot. And so there's a lot of take, and I hope it works. I hope the the slot does its job and the big fish survive and get to spawn, and Mother Nature lets the young of the year survive and everything works out. But, we'll see. Time will tell.
So how could it not work in your opinion? I mean, do you think they could take out like, that, because that's an entire class of fish, right? From 28 to 34 inches. I mean,
Yeah. So
if you put a beating on them, I mean, what's going to be the long-term impact on that?
well, that's the thing. And your older fish are getting older, and even if they die natural deaths and everything, so that's whittling down, hopefully the main thing is the spawning. Nobody, they know that in like heavy snow months and a lot of runoff and good fresh water mix, that makes for prolific survival of the young of the year, because they've been, seining, the DEC has, kept track for 50, 60 years in the Chesapeake and what happens with the young of the year. That's why you can tell, different year classes and where they're really successful and where they're not. And I think that's where we got in trouble initially, because everybody expected, oh, the spawning's great, everything's going, because there was 96, 97, 98, there was some unbelievable off the chart spawning. But then it dropped off into oblivion, for like 10 years. Well, all of a sudden, now you can kill two fish at 28 inches or whatever, and nobody realized that the spawning wasn't that great at all. So you sort of whack the upcoming fish, and then all of a sudden Mother Nature isn't backing it up with the young of the year, and now you're in trouble again. Like I said, luckily there was actually a year class in 2011 that there was a big spawning year, but nobody knows where it went. Virginia wanted to increase their take, and they're taking their fish at 20 inches or 18 inches because they leave the Chesapeake. So it's sort of, it's tough because all the user groups want, and you don't know what happens to these year classes, and the next thing you know, it's like, wow, what happened to them? They're all gone. So you got another chance at 2015 where you got an abundant spawning production, and now they're coming into a slot that hopefully Mother Nature keeps doing her thing, and it doesn't, otherwise you whack that year class and you're back to, so it's, whatever, it's tough, it's a,
yeah. It seems like one of the main issues at hand here in terms of keeping track of everything and whatnot is that every state has different regulations. What do you think it would take to get every state on the same page, or
well, you'd have to
not be possible?
Yeah, that's the problem, because the states are represented by their stakeholders. So in Virginia, it's represented by commercial fishermen, pretty much, and Maryland the same thing, because the Chesapeake and the Connecticut. So it's a catch and release, or whatever, it's a game fish status. So New Jersey, there's no commercial fishing for stripers, but they allocate everything to the recreational angler, and so the recreational angler, he's taking most of the fish, and that's the thing is, I believe now it's not so much the commercial take, there's a lot of that too, but it's the recreational angler. When they first did the models, they never, they thought, okay, if there's 2 million anglers up and down the coast fishing for stripers, well, there wasn't. When it came back in the 90s and stuff, everybody caught on and bought boats, and there was really 10 million anglers fishing for them. So your take and what the impact is can happen pretty quickly. So and I believe it's the education of the angler, and I believe everybody wants to do the right thing, and that's why I often get asked, oh, let's keep a striper, I want to take one home for lunch today or for dinner. So I said, I don't keep them. They're like, what? And I said, I really don't, and let me explain why. And once I explain, to them, look at this was, this great conservation success story because they had wiped them off the planet practically, and after 10 years, they came roaring back. And now we're back to repeating the same mistakes that we made. So, there's already enough killing. You can buy it in a store, there's plenty of striper. It's expensive, but I just, it's too precious of a resource, to catch only once and kill it, let's say. So I just, my thoughts are, I don't want to kill the fish. I want to, I want to have the fun and the enjoyment and everything else. And if it was robust, I mean, in the past when it was gangbusters, okay, a couple of fish a year or whatever. I mean, I had all different ways to make striped bass, but when you see what's happened, then it's like, well, wait a second, maybe this isn't good, And for me, I think most people want the enjoyment of the fishing. It's not like I got to go kill a bunch, but if they realize what's going on, it's the education of the angler. I believe that, if you look at New Jersey and all those boats going out, you don't think there's a problem. The angler doesn't know. He thinks that this is wonderful. Look at all these fish. But if you realize that that's the whole East Coast population you're looking at, then it's like, wow, well, if you still want to continue to have, fun with your family and everything, you really got to think about, how much do you need, I mean, I watch these, it's like the old days, they chop up these 50-pounders and bags and bags and bags, and it goes into a freezer. And then, do you use it? Do you need that much? I don't know. I'm not sure what the answer is, but, I just, I want people to know exactly what the state is. And I think, education's the thing. Most of the recreational anglers don't realize that, we may have some problems here. So we got to be conscious of what we're doing.
Yeah, definitely. Have you ever had a client, kind of get angry at the fact that they can't bring home a fish?
No, but they'll mention it here and there. They'll, oh God, I wish we could. I had one the other day. There's spin guys and everything, and I said, look at, there's a horde of bluefish now. Makes great ceviche, and most of my chef friends, Tom Colicchio and Carrie Heffernan, and they would much prefer a bluefish. And I know people look at it, what, but bluefish fresh. Bluefish ceviche and smoked bluefish is awesome, and they like it because there's actual flavor in the meat itself. The striper, is a pretty bland white meat fish, and you could throw some sauce and you could do it different ways. And trust me, I think it's delicious, in all different ways. But that being said, most of my chef friends, they'll take bluefish over stripers, So I just think that, it's too important of a game fish that everybody enjoys catching to have it disappear again, and I just don't want to see that happen. So I just think we have to be careful.
So would you endorse game fish status across the board for them if you could?
Well, if I had my druthers, yes.
Yeah.
I'd love it. I think it should be up and down the coast because I think it's an iconic fish, and it's, but politically, I don't think that'll happen. I certainly wish it would, but it's just, I wish they would have never, in the old days, like that you'd catch, if I was on the flats and I caught, 10 fish, 5 of them were 36 inches over, it's every day. And now I'm lucky if I get one fish over 36 inches in a season on the flats.
Wow.
It used to be, almost every day that you'd have them, and the interesting thing, they were skinny back then. They'd be, 40 inches long, but really skinny. And the reason being is there was no bunker. These fish were, long 39-inch, 40-inch fish, but they, now the bunkers come back, and that same 40-inch fish, seems to, it's like all of a sudden the McDonald's opens and everybody's fat.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's funny because your average fish now because of the conservation efforts with the menhaden and trying to get the nets out and restore that. The beaches are alive now, not only with stripers because they got plenty of food, and that's what happens in Jersey and New York, and now all the bunker, but the whales, the dolphins, the sharks, it's insane. There was, I don't know if there's a Tim Regan with South Fork Salt.
Yeah,
yesterday.
he was our last guest.
Yeah, well, he's great. We just did the flats together,
Yeah,
and
I saw the
I just
video. Amazing.
yeah. So he's, he shoots some great, but he shot the 12 pelicans the other day going down the beach. Well, it's just unreal. It's like, wow. And whether it's global warming or climate change or whatever, but it's weird because like last year, I never have seen spinner sharks up in Montauk,
Yeah.
and there was hundreds of them last year. And whether it's the water temperature change, like I say, climate change, or it's just the abundance of bait, but the sharks and the life and the whales, the dolphin. I had all summer long giant tuna, almost, I don't know, once, twice a week, 300 yards from shore. And here comes jumping out of the water is a 300-pound tuna.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's the life. And, what good conservation and trying to, work within the system and, what it could be. And that's the thing. Yeah, I'd love to have the striper. Can you imagine what it'd be like? I mean, it even back in the, when it recovered back in the mid 90s and stuff, it was, like I said, biblical. It was insane how the blitzes and the flats themselves, I didn't have to go anyplace. I mean, I literally I remember one day, we're sitting at the dock and I got my skiff there and I'd actually just come in, and this guy fishing looks down and he looks at my fly that I've got on the rod and he says, "What the hell do you use that for?" And I said, "I use it for stripers." He said, I'd never use that for stripers." I said, "Dude, that thing is awesome." And it was a bonefish fly, and he says, "I'd never use that." I said, "When you see this in the water and what it looks like, I don't know." And so I grabbed the tip of the rod and we're sitting at the dock tied up. And I said, "Look at this thing in the water." So I'm jiggling it along. He says, "Yeah." So, and all of a sudden this monster bass comes out from underneath the dock and inhales this thing and streaks off, takes me into the backing between all the boats and and the guy's like, "Jesus Christ, you got any more of those?" you know, but that's how prolific the stripers were. They were around every dock, they were around every beach, I mean, inlet, estuary, it was awesome because when they came back with a vengeance, So, that's what it could be like. And, it's just, once again, you go back and you think, oh, I mean, I remember begging them back then, don't decrease the size limit. Why not give them another, chance to spawn?
Yeah.
Oh, there's plenty of fish. There's plenty of fish. Yeah. And then they, changed from one fish, lowered the size to 28 inches. And then a few years later went to two fish. Oh, there's so many fish. Oh, why don't you err on the side of caution?
Right.
And they just, oh, it's all good. It's all good. And then all of a sudden it ain't so good because Mother Nature, didn't come through on her end of it and keep producing more and more and more. So we find ourselves in trouble again. I hope that, like I said, I'd like to see everything work out with the new regulations and the Amendment 7 and, and all this stuff, but only time's going to tell that. So.
Yep, that's it. So as somebody who makes a living off of, fishing for stripers, how did the moratorium affect you when it was put into place?
Well, what do you mean, the old moratorium?
Yeah.
Well, it didn't, in those days I was just starting. there wasn't, nobody was really doing it because the striper had disappeared, so it slowly came back in the 80s and stuff. I didn't, when I first moved out here, it was like, well, this is the land of the stripers. Where are they? And
Yeah.
everybody said, oh, no, we fished them out. They're gone. You can't even keep them now, and that was the general, I mean, it was like, oh, so, but by the by 93, I think they declared it recovered in 95 or something. And I started my store 93, 94, and we had started seeing them, and it was like, wow, well, by 95, when the store is up and going and it's like all of a sudden somebody, flipped a switch. You had this, you're like, wow. And up into 2000, I don't know, maybe 7 or something, it was insane. The blitzes were on, the flats, we bought more boats, hired more guides. The whole thing exploded. When I first moved to Montauk, when I first started out there, the harbors were empty. All those, slips, there was no people out there fishing. It was a commercial fishery. There was guys bottom fishing and porgy fishing and this and that. But when the striper came back, now you can't get a slip in Montauk.
Yeah.
It's jammed. It's, everybody's like, wow, this is great. So it's created the, up and down the coast, the communities that benefit from the striped bass. That's why I say if this fish disappears and you go through this again, it's devastating to a lot of these communities because, it's become the iconic fish that everybody wants to catch and that drives the economies of, the small little towns, whether it's Montauk or up in the Cape or Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket, and, all these areas, the striper is the king.
And it has been for a while. I think I read in that book, On the Run, that the first taxable natural resource in America was the striped bass, and that tax money was used to build the first school.
Yeah. Yeah, there's all sorts of interesting, stuff about the striper in the early days, and I mean, there's still places, out in Montauk where you can see it, and up and down the coast, it's like they used to build these metal piers out there to, for guys to fish them, and the prisoners that, you couldn't feed them stripers, and, it's like lobsters too, they were so abundant and it was so prolific that they made rules, whether it's, you can't feed it to prisoners, you can't do this, because, the abundance was there, so it's interesting how it's all, come about, but it's an iconic fish.
Yeah, I don't think the average angler even knows, how big of an impact this fish has on economies and communities and all of that. But
well, you look at the, everybody's, gone out and bought boats, and, I mean, rods, reels, boats, gas, lodging, it adds up pretty quick, and it's worth
definitely,
billions,
definitely.
and that's why it's so important, and trying to get, people to realize that, this thing represents a lot to these communities, even if you're, the deli, you're selling. I look at Montauk and these delis, and they're jammed. Right before the boats go out there. I mean,
Oh
it's the
yeah,
economy.
definitely,
That's
definitely. So many aspects of it.
yeah. So, anywho,
So when I was doing some research on you, 3 names kept popping up that you're affiliated with: Lefty Cray, Flip Pallet, and Bob Popovic. Tell me a little bit about your relationship with those guys.
well, I guess I'd have to start with Bobby because. Popovich and I got to know each other back in the days of Orvis or something. I want to say I had him, come tie flies or something, or we met at it way back. I don't know, but we became friends right away. And I told him, I said, Bobby, you should come out and see some of this stuff, because they were fishing the beaches. He was a beach fisherman and he was a fly fisherman, and they had started way back when with the Atlantic's saltwater fly fishers, whatever, which was a club down there, and we knew Butch Colvin and a lot of the guys at Bobby's, I think. Started Bobby down there, when he got back from Vietnam, so I told him, you got to come out and take a look at some of this stuff and check the flats and everything. And so he did. He's like, yeah, I'd love to come out, and we just hit it off. And I love Bobby and his creativeness, and he's probably the greatest saltwater fly tyer ever created. Where he just all these patterns that have sort of been extrapolations on all his techniques and what he did and what he came up with, and the cool thing about Bobby was that he was netting bait, looking at bait, and then trying to mimic the bait, and so I just loved him because of the, not only the flies and what he was doing, but he was just a great individual, and we just really had a lot of fun. So, and he was the first guy that started filming. He'd say, oh, I want to film some of this stuff. So we got this big camera you put over your shoulder. And so we just started doing stuff. In the early days, it was the flats and so forth. And then, later on, a guy named John Applin, his family owned Walker's Cay. We met, and John and I started doing the flats quite a bit. He had eventually got a skiff also, and so he had met Lefty in New Zealand, and we wanted to sort of get Lefty to see this. And so he invited Lefty, I invited Bobby and Nick Hercione and all these other guys, Jose and whatever, that we thought, hey, let's Lefty's going to come, let's do this. Well, once Lefty saw the flats in the early days, he was blown away. Everybody was. They couldn't believe that. Even Gordy Hill is now 92 years old, and he grew up in Long Island out on the North Fork, and he goes way back, to the 30s and this, and remembers. But they never sight fished it, and so when Gordy came up and saw it, and he was fly fishing way back with his dad and everything else, but they just never thought, because of what was presumed about the striper, to do it on the flats, that they would be there. They just fished for him as they would. Well, when he saw the flats and Lefty and really started, seeing how the sight fishing was, they were all blown away. It was like, holy Jesus, is this cool? So it just sort of started this party. We called it the Pirates Party, and over the next 5 years, the who's who of saltwater fly fishing joined in, because they had heard about this, this phenomenon that was happening in the Northeast, and it was timing too. The striper had just made the greatest recovery of all time, and there was a million of them around, and you figure it out that they come up in these shallow areas in midday, and you can fish them just like you do bonefish, or permit or whatever. And so everybody jumped on board, and that's how the business grew. I bought more boats and hired more guides, and when people saw it, they'd come out from the city. It was like, oh my God, this is insane, and so it really, it blew up, and it created an industry.
Who were some of the anglers you looked up to when you were coming up?
Well, Jesus, there was, Lefty, of course, and Lefty, became a really good friend and everything. But, Flip ended up, because of John and the Walker's Cay Chronicles was filming at the time. I'd heard about Flip Pallett, from the early days and who he was, and he eventually came up here, and we shot a show together at Montauk, and he was blown away, by a lot of different aspects. We ran into a hurricane, and in the early days, they'd asked me to do if I do a show or something, or what can we do in the Northeast? And I told them, why don't you could get the price of 2 shows for one. You could do a shore show. We'll get Bob Popovich to do shore show, and we'll do a boat show, and you can shoot 2 shows. So they did, and unfortunately, we ran into a hurricane at the beginning of it, and Bobby sort of got screwed on his end, but it made up for it at the very end of it. But these are the days I was using my skiff with a bow rail, at Montauk. But you look at that footage from that, I think it was 96 or something, and the Blitz's flip was blown away. He was like, oh my God, he never realized, nobody did. When you see that, there's acres and acres of fish up on the surface frothing. They were like, oh my God. So it not only made for great TV, but it sort of put Montauk on the map as a fly fishing destination. And so, and Bobby was filming all this stuff. When we first started, they did a show in New Jersey. And when we first started, I had my store. We were promoting the guide business, and Bobby had shot all this footage. So in those days, it was like on a VCR or something. So Orvis gave me a bunch of booths at the fly fishing show that started in New Jersey. And we set up a TV, and we showed Popovic's, his video that he'd shot of the blitzes of this stuff. And the fire marshals would come to us, and there was so many people wanting to see that film that they started blocking the aisles, and it became this huge jam. And everybody's like, look at this, look at this, look at these fish. Oh my God, and they made us shut it off because the people were blown away,
Oh my God.
and that's what sort of sparked it. All of a sudden word got out and said, man, you got to come see the striped bass fishery in Montauk and what's going on. And so, like I said, it was just fortunate that the recovery was happening at the same time that, we sort of started doing all this, and timing's everything, I guess, Victor. I don't
Definitely
know,
is, especially in this sport.
Yeah.
So in terms of like cornering the market of flats fishing in Montauk, have you pretty much done that, or do you have anybody that's tried to sneak in and kind of compete with you on this level?
Well, there's a lot of, you finally find out you're training your competition. There's now a slew of guides. Some of them used to work for me, and everything else. But it takes a lot of figuring. The flats isn't, it's not an easy game and everything, so it's challenging. And there's some great guides. There's also a bunch of guys out here, probably 5 or 6 on the South Fork. There's some great guys over in the North Fork that are, Vinny Canilano and Andrew Durr and Brendan, and there's guys over here, Merritt and David. They're all good, but it's the way that you finally, I guess, as you get older. In the early days, you're like, oh, screw those guys, what do they, this is mine, but as you come to find out that it doesn't affect you, to me, and everything else. It's sort of the camaraderie in a sense, but it's also, your fishing will speak for itself. And that's with all competition.
Yep.
You can have two delis open next to you, but if you make the best pizza or the best sandwich or the best, that's where people are going to, come. And so in the long term and everything else, I just try to do the best I can, and that's the way it is, And we, you find in the guiding business that everybody has personalities. I may be too tough, or people say the guy will yell at you, Jesus Christ, and they want somebody that won't. So so they'll fish with somebody else, and so each has their own. It's like, one guy is like, oh, he's so mellow, whatever, and everybody has their personalities, and that's the guide business. You may say, oh, that guy's an asshole, or that guy is, but everybody sort of finds their fit with the guides that they like. In the competition, it's usually friendly competition, and it's not, I don't have any problems really with guys out here. It's a small area, and it is getting crowded. It's not really the guides. The guides have remained pretty much the same, but it's everybody that wants to get a flats boat and wants to look where you're fishing and then wants to go there the next day. And
Yeah.
that has become that's sort of the thing that, there's just more people, there's more activity, there's more of everything now on the water. There's paddle boards, there's kayaks, there's jet skis, there's, so you got a big user group, whereas maybe 20 years ago you didn't have any of that. I didn't, paddle boards weren't around, kayaks, nobody really did it and stuff. And, the reason I chose East Hampton to do my store, was because they didn't allow jet skis. Southampton, they allowed jet skis. And so jet skis on the flats, it's not a great mix.
No.
So for me, there were some decisions as far as, trying to find the pristine jet ski free water, and where you have water clarity. That's another thing. A lot of areas, it can be really good back in the Western Sound and everything at times, but eventually a lot of the areas, their clarity due to nutrients in the water and blooms and just water quality, it goes to nothing. At least out here on the East End, there's constant clear water that comes in because you're so close to, so you don't have water issues, as much as some of the other areas.
Yeah. Those jet skis, huh?
Yeah.
Bad for business.
Yeah. It's the same thing in the Keys. The jet skis, it's just gotten out of control.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, they either, you have to find a way, luckily they don't allow them in the parks because of the birds and everything, and there's boundaries.
That's good.
But it's just gotten ridiculous. I had friends take photographs I think 3 weeks ago, and they're on the flats for tarpon fishing, and they're lined up waiting for the fish, and here come 300 jet skis.
Nice.
Because now well, what they do in social media, they're making hey, we're going to have a rave, and we're going from Miami to Key West. This everybody, and so everybody's entitled to your fun and games. But when they come 300 of them down the flats in 1.5 feet or 2 feet of water,
you might as well just go home.
Yeah, it's like, wow, there's just no respect for the environment, the people, it's like, hey, share the resource, it's like, wow, what a way to so it makes it difficult. It's a changing world.
It definitely is. I want to circle back to something you said before about how the stripers come up on the flats in the afternoon or in the midday. So are you still trying to target them in the morning, or is like midday like the peak time to really be able to get them?
Well, it's the combo of everything. The secret of sight fishing for stripers is having the conditions all coincide. So what I mean is, the stripers, it's moving water that gets them to feeding mode. Current velocity. It's not whether it's high tide, low tide. It could be slack, high slack. The point is that when they begin to hunt, when they're running around, is at certain phases in the tide that creates a velocity that they like. But you got to have, for what we're doing, I got to have high sun. I got to be able to see them. So ideally is I want a midday, let's say low tide, and because my sun is going to be let's say 9:30 o'clock to 2:30. That's my best sun and angle, that I've got bright sun so I can see them, and I've got moving water and tide, and it's not super high and it's not super low, and I can catch both ends of a tide. I can catch the bottom of the tide as it drops out, and I can catch as it comes in. And certain areas are going to have fish on the incoming tide, and certain areas you're going to find them, on the outgoing, or, whatever. So the secret of the flats pretty much is, you got to have sun, and you got to have some moving water when conditions are right, and, in the old days, there was a zillion fish everywhere, and it really didn't matter. But now it's a thinking man's game. I got to figure out where I got moving water, and it may be 6 miles from where, or 10, so I'm running a lot more and I'm fishing different areas, and I'm having to really think about the current. Oh, I still got some current here. Let's run there real quick before it dies, so, but the high sun is for the sight fishing is the thing. You want to be able to see the fish. Same thing with bonefish, permit, tarpon. It's all about, not only seeing them, but, when they're ready to eat, and when they're on the flats looking to eat, so that's
Yeah.
the key.
So considering all the different factors that go into the proper conditions, um, it seems like there's a lot more things that need to be taken into consideration as opposed to somebody who's going out on a 6-pack, snag and drop northeast boat, or down east boat. So how many trips would you say you have to cancel every season just because the conditions aren't lining up?
Well, here's the thing, and everybody, I used to, years ago and everything, I never even used my big boat, my contender or whatever, till I didn't even put it in the water till September. But because of changing conditions and how things are going, I started putting it in earlier and earlier. And the reason being is that, unfortunately, if you're using your flat skiff like I used to and everything else, in the old days, it wasn't so bad because let's say I got the sunny day, it's great. But let's say I got a cloudy day, well, even those areas that, 2 days before when I had sun and there's a zillion fish all over this one area, and you think, well, it's cloudy, I can go in there and blind cast, I'll get those things. You could, and you could, and you could do decent, but it's not like sight fishing. You work for them, and you're going to work an area, and you're blind casting for them, and we'd get them. Well, now because of the population and everything else, that's really difficult, and there's always bluefish, and the bluefish, supplement everything. And we've got some really cool bluefish stuff that happens, like when they come up and they're finning, and, there's big schools in the spring, and, the bluefish is such an underrated species anyway. It's just, a 15-pound bluefish on fly, sight fishing, or even, the pop, what, it's a great fish. So that's, but now, what I found is that, I've had to change the whole business plan. So I put both boats in when I get back from Florida in May. This year I dropped the earliest I've ever dropped my big boat. And the reason being is that, if I got really cloudy conditions and stuff and it's not flats doable, I'm going to take the big boat, and I'm going to go look for those bigger fish, and look for other stuff, because, the flats, it turns into a grind. It's really tough. I can't go out in a really sort of cloudy, miserable day and say, okay, we're going to take the skiff, and we're going to blind cast, because, I mean, you'll catch a few, you might get lucky, and, and really, whatever. But my chances on the bigger boat and going out and, doing that, it gives me much more, latitudes where I can go places, and I can really look, and Montauk, if the fish are moving, and I can, so that's sort of how I've changed mine. I've got both boats, and I just had to adapt to the conditions and to, what Mother Nature sort of brings us.
Got to adapt. It's the only way to
That's
keep going.
right.
So I've heard you talk a lot about bonefish and permit, and I know that you spend half of the year in the Keys guiding. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah, I
So,
usually go down there in January and come back in, I don't know, mid-May or something.
nice. So let's hear a little bit about flat fishing down there. What are you going after?
Well, I used to go out there every time when I, was at the Ocean Reef. It was, the bone fishing back then before 2010, when they had a reef freeze, and it sort of changed things. And it was great. I mean, the big fish, tailing fish, monsters, 10 pounds and over and everything. Isla Morada, Biscayne Bay and everything had really big bonefish. And so permit everything there. But I became fascinated with the tarpon pretty early on. and so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out tarpon. And so I would say that now, as time has gone by, and the bonefish has gone through some problems of its own. The seagrasses are really having problems in Florida. The pollution, the algae blooms, and everything else. It's become, the habitat is the problem down there. The fish are sort of protected, but it's the habitat and what they're doing. But through organizations like the Bonefish Tarpon Trust and stuff, they sort of figured out that by doing all these studies all over the Caribbean, and for 20 years the bonefish population in the Florida Keys was diving, and then after 2010 they had this huge freeze, and they found 18-pound bonefish floated up dead on the beaches and stuff, and so it was really bad for a while, and then BTT went to these different areas, and then they finally figured out, well, maybe Cuba has something to do with this because of currents, and so they went to Cuba, and weirdly enough, there's consortiums, and there's bonefish lodges and floating motherships and stuff that and so all the guides at those places actually had degrees because the education system in Cuba in marine bio. And so when the scientists, they all started talking, these guys told them, oh, well, there's these nets, and these guys come out with these mile-long, seine nets, and they go over the flats getting bonefish because the people were hungry, and they, it was like, we got to eat something, so they netted all the bonefish. Well, the BTT realized that wait a second here, that's probably the same fish that are, after they spawn, because of all the research they've done, the current takes them into the Florida Keys, and maybe that's the reason why the Keys bonefish population is diving. So they went to the Cuban government and they said, look, you got this resource and you guys are netting it. And the good thing, I guess, about a communist society is once they say, okay, you can't do that anymore, there's no voting, there's no congressional, it's like, you won't do that anymore. And so they quit netting them, like, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, after BTT talked to them. And now the bonefish in the Keys is skyrocketing. It's all coming back, So, it's sort of cool. But, for myself down there, I just really got infatuated with the tarpon, and I spent a lot of time, and I love the fish because they do so many different things. They float up, they travel. I got my friends now in Charleston and some of these areas in the Chesapeake that are slaying tarpon because they're finding that they come further north than they did, and, originally thought. And, but it's just such a great fish. There's small ones, big ones, they go lay up, they come down the coast. There's just all this aspects about this great fish that loves to, it's like the giant that eats peanuts, and they, jump, and they're acrobatic, and the tarpon's protected, so there's a lot of tarpon. The only problem with their situation, like all of it down there, is their habitat's getting destroyed. But that's the fish that I spend most of my time in the Keys on.
I heard that the hookup to landing ratio with tarpon is 1-9.
That's right.
That's correct.
Yeah. Well, they just, it's a technical game, especially with the ocean fish running the ocean. They've got they're actually, as they come to find out, because the research is that, they're in spawning mode. They're going down to meet up and go offshore and spawn. So they're not in tune to take a fly at certain times and everything, but it's just they could be tough, but it's the challenge. Plus they have a real hard mouth, so even if you hook them, it's like hooking a cinder block. A lot of times it's like, I got him, and he takes 2 jumps and he jumps off. But that's the game. and it's feeding these fish that's the fun, because you see it all, and all these different through the ages techniques, it's funny how, it's like in the Northeast, the double overhanded strip into stripping baskets was taken for granted. Popovics and all the guys that fished the beaches and everything, you used a stripping basket. All our early days on the beach, Orvis came out with a strip, and you stripped underarms so that you could keep your line away from your feet on the beaches. Well, Bob Popovics and Lance, when they came down, we fished underarm. Well, it's become the go-to how to feed fish now because of the worm. When Scott Collins and Dave DeLue turned around and put incorporated that stripping method with the worm, they won all three tarpon tournaments in the same year. It had never been done before. And that's sort of sharing, where the Northeast meets the South, and that combination, revolutionized tarpon fishing in a sense. It was like, wow, it's like the toad fly. All of a sudden a fly comes out that they eat the hell out of it, and you think, holy shit, and it sort of changed. So that's the fun of it, it's the figuring it out, whether it's the stripers, the tarpon, the permit. There's the fish, spend a lifetime on the permit, trying to, because they're a smart critter. They're a sucker for a live crab, but try to feed them a fly. It's a different game. But boy, there's the guys, Will Benson and Nathaniel Linville and Justin Ray, and there's too many to count, in the lower keys. They've really unlocked. Originally it was Dale Perez and Steve Huff and Del Brown that sort of changed the whole, permit. We thought of impossible to catch on fly until, Steve Huff and Del Brown proved it different, and innovation and flies. And, so it's, but that's the fun of the whole game.
So it sounds like there's a lot of tactics that cross over from fishing the flats and the Keys to fishing the flats in Montauk, right?
Absolutely. Half the flies that I use in Montauk and everything else are, used down in the Keys.
And are you tying most of your flies, or are you using bobs?
No, I tie most of, Bobby's, I have stuff tied for me now for, I'll show something to the tires. The problem is I spend a lifetime waking up at 5. I'd fill boxes and boxes of flies, and especially at the Montauk, blitzes. And you start out with, oh, look at this box. I use take picture. Oh, isn't this cool? And 2 weeks later, it's destroyed because you've gone through and they're eaten up. And now you're 5 a.m. tying flies before you're, going out in charters, and literally I tie a dozen, I love Bob's little epoxy fly, and I used to tie it with polar fiber, and, and it was great because it really was deadly. It worked. But I'm trying to tie 6 or 7 flies, in 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, and then you get home and they're all gone because the bluefish ate them, or they broke them off, and the albies, and whatever. So now, I have them tied by guys that are great tiers, and they basically, here's the pattern, but most of my flat stuff I still tie. All the tarpon stuff I tie. The bonefish, a lot of the striper stuff. My flats fishing, I tie myself. But then there's, some stuff, Glenn Nicholson used to tie some crabs for me that were insane, that were deadly, that we use, and we tweak, I've just been fortunate to know these fantastic, fly tires, and work with them and say, okay, well, it started with Popovics and, Glenn Nicholson, all his epoxy stuff was insane. Bob Vaverka is the one that came up with the crab patterns, years ago. And, Joe Blados with the crease fly, we just, that's half the fun is, the sharing the flies and tweaking stuff and doing. But I'm still, yesterday, same thing, get a day off and I'm downstairs tying flies. I've meanwhile called my fly tires trying to get prepped, because it's coming the fall and I know I'll get slammed again.
Yeah, definitely. That's crazy. It just seems like it just never ends, huh?
Yep. It's
It's a good thing, though.
ongoing.
It's a good
Yeah,
thing.
it's great.
So last year you won the Isaac Walton Award from the American Museum of Fly Fishing. How was that? And what are some other accolades that you've acquired over the course of your career?
Oh God. I'm humbled. It's really an honor. I mean, I was out of the blue and all of a sudden you get a call and say, we want to present, but you never look at it that way. I got involved with the conservation because how I felt about things and what you could see on the water and see happening, and it wasn't, I just did it. And, so it's great to be recognized. It was totally unexpected, very humbling. But it's just, I just started it, sort of early on because I became concerned. It's sort of like the evolution. You think, oh my God, look at this. This is great. This is, but I'd also seen when there was no fish. It was like, what do you mean there's no stripers here? This is the land of the striper. This is back in the 80s, Look at this. What do you mean? Oh, no, we fished them out. I mean, when I learned that when I came from California, it was like, you're kidding me, But within 10 years, it came roaring back. And so you just thought, oh my God, look at it. And then when you could see it again, it's like, well, it's like you better speak up, So, we just started dove in and it's just like, I just did what I love doing. Fly fishing was my passion. So I just put it together and I got really lucky by some of the choices that I made and the people that I met and everything. And all of a sudden it's 20 years later and just the stuff that you just did, I did it because, my kids and I wanted the striper to still be here. And the same thing, I got involved with Atlantic salmon, because it's like, wow, what a great fish. And then you see all the problems with them. And so I just, when I'd see something like BTT, the same thing, it's like, God, if I can help, I want to help, because you could see what was happening. And so it's like, all right, I'm in, and so and then, years later, they turn around and say, wow, you did it, so, I'm really honored. It's it's totally unexpected, but, and there's been stuff, down the road, this year's, I don't know, BTT announced that, I'm getting the Lefty Cray Award, which is, it's
That's
like,
amazing.
wow. Yeah, I was
For the people
away.
that don't know, what does BTT stand for?
Bonefish Tarpon Trust.
Gotcha.
And it was created, way back when. And I don't know if I told you the story, but I was invited to go down to the ocean reef and fish down there and guide down there by a guy. And so when I got down there was a bunch of guys that said, look at it. And those days it was called Bonefish Tarpon Unlimited. And it was just a bunch of guys that really got worried about what was happening. And what they thought was, okay, why don't we form something and start getting some science on these fish? Because they've never been studied. They study tuna, they study food fish, because of the commercial value. But none of this stuff, the habitats of the bonefish, the tarpon, the permit, none of it was studied. So they thought, why not find out about these fish and what's needed and everything else and see if, we can start getting some data so we understand what's going on. So they started this thing. And when I walked into the meeting, here's, Billy Pate and Stu Apt and, just everybody, I forget who it is, Sandy Moret and I think Del Perez and, just with Bill Curtis and, all these great guides and people that I'd heard about down in the Keys. So it was like, wow, look at this. And it was everybody saying, okay, we got to find this out. This is, so they did, they started it. And I mean, we tagged the first tarpon with the telemetry tag with the guy that was sort of the leader, Tom Davidson, and put this $8,000 tag in his so that they could track and see where these fish were going and, where they were, vulnerable to be, killed or, whatever. So, and now years later, they are responsible for a lot of the great stuff that is happening in Florida because, they have the data, there's a spawning site called the Western Dry Rocks, for permit. And so the DEC was going to shut it all down because of the spawning out there. And BTT, had the data because they were, they had been tagging permit. So they worked with the DEC and all the user groups to try to define, does it have to be totally shut down or maybe just during spawning season? So some of the work and, through the Bahamas and the different countries and understanding these fish and what's happening, it's really helped, and it's really, they've become a great voice. It's like Captains for Clean Water. You see what's happening in Florida.
Yep.
And the people are finally standing up and saying, wait a second, we've had enough. Everybody comes to Florida to fish, to see the reef, to snorkel, to dive, and you go to the Everglades. That's what the big attraction is. It's this insane environmental area, and they're destroying it. They're just, it's like you can't believe that, it's so short-sighted what's going on, and so anyway, so the BTT and a lot of things like Captains for Clean Water and everything else, we're trying to, to make sure that there's something for future generations.
Well, thank God that they're doing that work. Somebody's got to, otherwise we're not going to have anything. So.
Yeah, that's why, everybody just needs to step up, and get educated. And, it's like I said, it's a tough one. This environmental stuff is, I mean,
yeah, especially when there's money involved,
Well, that's the thing, it's just like this, with the whatever amendment or bill that they tried to slide through down in Florida, where the Captains for Clean Water, all of a sudden everybody ran to Tallahassee. So this thing, they were supposed to have this reservoir, and all of a sudden they were defunding it under the table without, so, there's just all these political, things that are happening, whether you represent big sugar or development or, it becomes contentious, but, you fight the battles and and I've always believed in, you got to get involved, otherwise don't sit and complain.
Yep.
If you're not involved with it and you want to, whatever, don't be an armchair quarterback.
Yeah.
Either
get involved or keep your mouth shut.
That's right.
That's
so,
anyway. What are some of the coolest places you fished outside of the Keys and Montauk?
Oh boy. God, there's been so many. Seychelles, 25 year ago, 20 years ago, whatever it was a magical area. It hadn't been fished before. So there was a mothership that John Fisher from Urban Angler had found that was actually a dive boat. And so we did an expedition down there. I think a few weeks after we did ours, which was like second or third trip that they had done down there, and just insane. I mean, it takes you 3 days to get there, but it was the fishery and the life and the stuff was. But I think it was either a month or after we went, the ship was taken by pirates.
Wow.
From Somalia. So they took the captain of the ship. So
I'm the captain now.
Yeah, so that was a good one. I fished all over Mexico and Belize and
how about New Zealand for some of those big trout?
I haven't. I haven't. I went all the way in the old days. I went all the way down to New Guinea and all but I never made it to Australia or New Zealand, and I'd love to. I mean, it's funny. I took my kids. When I was 16, I got invited to this hunting and fishing camp that I worked in Newport at the guy, his surf shop, and he sold it and bought this camp up in Idaho on Henry's Lake, that feeds the Henry's Fork. And so, I worked, that's where I first started, in 1971 fly fishing. And then this about 3 years ago, my kids now are, 25 and 27, or at the time they were just a little younger. And I decided, let's go west, and I have some great friends out there. And so we went and did all the rivers out west and everything, and ended up getting this, out of the Missouri with this monster brown. Even the guide, we caught this thing, and the guide, I said, "So that's a great fish? Is that a real?" He's like, "Dude, that's the biggest one I've ever caught in my 20 years." I was like, "Oh, okay." I've just, I've done some great steelhead fishing up in the Babine. I've done Atlantic salmon. I love steelhead and Atlantic salmon. I think they're tremendous fish. They go to the salt water, they come back. They're the hard fighters. They're sort of like the tarpon. They can be tricky to, get them to eat, and, whatever. It's challenging. The Bahamas, we've spent numerous times. My friend John had a supply ship for the Walker's Cay Chronicles, the Walker's Cay, where they, bring this boat in. It was an old scow. But we'd put 2 skiffs on the back end. We'd go to the thrift store and we'd buy like old couches and old shit. We'd set up this like living room on the back of this thing. It was a oil rig workboat, but it had this huge back end. And so we'd set up that, and big barbecue and turkey fryers, and, we'd take skeet, and, and we'd go through the Bahamas and stuff. And, this is way before the days that they built all the lodges and everything. And so we sort of say, hey, this area looks really interesting. Let's go try this. And some of the fishing then, God, the bone fishing and the stuff that we'd find, the mutton snapper on the flats, it was great times and great adventure. I've done, like I said, mostly through the Caribbean and Mexico, and I used to off California. Just all sorts of fun stuff.
Have you ever taken a billfish on the fly?
Yes. Yeah. I actually fished the Harry Gray tournament down in Costa Rica, he was one of the first innovators, and that sort of taught everybody, about billfish. So I've had sailfish. I actually fished with Sandy Barrett and watched Sandy, tag a few for the tournament they actually do in Islamorada now for fly sale. And it was a blast. I've thrown it a lot. My friends, George and Rudy started this thing in Magdalena Bay. That was a great adventure. I think it was 2 years ago.
I've heard that location is absolutely insane.
Yeah, and I grew up in California, so Magdalena Bay always had this mystique, because that's where the gray whales, at an early age there, even at grade school, they taught you about Magdalena Bay, because all the gray whales went and spawned down there. So these young guys, it's sort of strange, but George was a client up here. His dad would bring him when he was like, 15 years old, and he got into the fly fishing. And 2 years ago, he calls me, and it's like, Paul, it's George Vandercook. You remember me? I was like, George, what are you doing? And he tells me about this thing that he and his buddy discovered in Magdalena Bay with striped marlin on the fly, and I'm like, so how you teasing them? What are you doing? He said, no, we're not teasing them. I said, well, how you getting? He said, we're just casting at them. I'm like, okay, so how many can you hook a day? Oh, we've had 100 hookups. I'm like,
What?
what? You know, it
So
was
were you on
like,
the next flight over there?
yeah, well, finally, my friend, we have this a friend that has this mothership, and he was going around to Alaska, and so, it wasn't during the sailfish or the striped marlin time, but Rudy was and George were up here, and we were going to go striper fishing, and my buddy calls and he says, "Hey, I'm over here in at Cabo, and what about doing that Magdalena Bay?" So these guys flew back real quick. We arranged this thing, and a week later, we're in Magdalena Bay, but we know it's not striped marlin season. So these guys went down and scouted. They said, "We know this area where there's rooster fish." And so we went down. Well, when we arrived, it was on. It was like they had found it, and it was like, "Dude, you're not going to believe this." So we went down there, and oh my God, we had roosters up to 50 pounds, and they're coming down the beaches, and the birds are blowing up. And I mean, I think on my Instagram, it was the biggest watched, was you see this rooster footage, and the jacks and the life, the birds, and not a soul, nobody around,
That's like the best part, right?
Oh, it's just, and it's such a magical
No
place,
jet skis.
Exactly. So, but it's a big commercial fishery, which so and that's impacting it a lot. But still, it's almost you look at it, and it's how I remember Cabo growing up. Cabo now is it's a shit show. It's become a tourist. It's lost all its charm and all the great stuff. It's just become so Americanized and so jet skied and parasailing and all the
And
things that
overfished. I mean,
that's right.
it's totally overfished. I mean, I've seen pictures of pickup trucks filled, stacked up with marlin and sailfish from
Yeah.
Cabo.
When I Cabo San Lucas, eventually they changed it, and the Mexicans, really started realizing. When I used to fly down there, and this is way back, in the 70s and 80s and everything, and we would fly into the little airport. And Cabo was a sleepy little village, whatever. And there was a tournament called the Bisbee that was out of Newport Beach, and they used to, have it down there because it was so epic, and the boats would go down. But when I used to fly into that airport, as you flew over the desert, there was thousands of marlin carcasses out there, because in those days they didn't eat them. The people would take some of it, whatever, but they just wanted to hang it up behind the boat, shoot a picture, and they'd throw it out in the desert. Eventually they stopped them doing it when they realized, but you still see a lot of, and it's unfortunate. It's turned into a big tourist hotel, build it like Miami, and but boy, you go up to Mag Bay, and you see how it used to be in the old days at Cabo. That's why it was so exciting last year going. I'm going to go back because these Los Locos Mag Bay, these guys are unreal, and they've got a cool setup. And it's not fancy, but it's a great spot to, you get showers, a nice room, great food, little village, and the fishing is off the charts. It's like it should be, but it'll change. It'll, just like Cabo, everything will get to, just whatever.
That's crazy that you could see the carcasses from the plane. I mean, that would be like flying to like Nova Scotia to go tuna fishing, and you're looking down and you just see bluefin tuna carcasses all over. I'd be like, this trip might not pan out the way I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, it's crazy, but that's how it used to be. They actually, the Spanish government or the Mexican government actually started trying to take, and the people realized, I mean, yeah, I used to go down there a lot. I spent a lot of time in Baja, and you'd see the finning operations for sharks going on, and
Terrible.
just also
Terrible.
terrible abuses and overfish this and that. But there's a lot of areas that the people want to do the right thing. They, especially the guides and the user groups and everything else, they know there's a commercial aspect to it, but they're also anyway. So
So let's end with this question because this has been an epic interview, and I would like to hear your advice for the upcoming generation of anglers right now.
Um, get involved. I think the most important thing is it's getting harder and harder to guide, and it's because of the environment, competition, this and that, and everything else. But I found myself that all I wanted to do was figure it out, get better, at my profession, so to speak, and try to protect the waters that I'm fishing, because you got to have something to fish for. So, and it's getting harder. There's everybody wants to be a guide. This and there's a lot of competition in Florida, and there's a lot of different types of guides and user groups. There's the guys that are on the flats and they're fishing the flats, and there's guys in bay boats and they're running across and they're spin fishing and so I just always believed I wanted to become the best that I could possibly be, and at the same time, sort of get involved so that the fishery and the issues that affect my business, that they're sort of safeguarded, and there's many like-minded, anglers out there. Everybody, it's all about the fish. If you're going to choose fishing as your livelihood, then you try to protect your livelihood, and that's whether it's commercial or recreational. That's why the commercial guy I get, because it's getting harder and harder and harder to make a living and this and that, and you get restricted and what can I take, what I can't. But I guess it's through the right regulations and working within the system that you hope that there's a common ground that it comes down to. It's all about the fish. So let's all think about the best way that we can all make a living on the water, and have something to fish for. So that's to me, that's the important thing. And just becoming the best you can at the sport. That's all I wanted to do. Is I wanted to learn as much as I could, to observe and to see what made this thing work. And it's the exploring and and finding out new things and new fish habits and new flies or lures or techniques and stuff, and that's what keeps it interesting, and that's what builds your clientele. When the guys know that this guy's into it, he's got it dialed. It's everybody says, oh, where do you advertise, where do you it's word of mouth. I learned a long time ago. I became my own worst enemy in a sense, because everybody say, oh, we'd love to have some articles. Well, write articles, right? Well, you sort of trade everybody, give everything away, and it's like, wow. And what it does is it just creates more people want. So it became, wow, maybe I should, I don't know. So it's a double-edged sword. You want to teach, but at the same time, it's like, it's my business. I'm trying to figure this out. And so the advertising for me and stuff, I didn't really, in the early days I did it, but it's word of mouth. And to me, that's sort of where everything goes, because if you're good and if you start getting a reputation and everything, then it's word of mouth that spreads and brings you your clients, and that this guy knows what he's doing, and I think that that, and being personable and just trying to have fun and enjoy it, and that's one of the things I tell young guys now. It's not all about the fish. The fish is a big part of it, but people want to go out and have fun, see nature, be one with it, and at least get out there, and that's half the fun. It's sort of like the hunt. You're not going to get them every time, but you're going to have your chances. You're going to have a great time doing it, a bunch of laughs with a bunch of great people, and that's what it's all about.
I love it. This is great, man. Thank you so much, Paul, for calling in. It's been a heck
No,
of
Victor,
an
my
episode.
pleasure.
And I'll definitely be looking to book a charter with you this fall for sure. I don't fly fish, but
it does. I do spin too, and I love the same thing with spin fishing. It took me a long time. I couldn't feed a fish on the flats with spinning to save my life. It took me a long time to figure out how to do it. But now it's so it's all fishing and it's all good. That's what. I just choose to use the fly because I like the challenge. But let me tell you something. There is nothing like watching a big striper blow up on a plug or whatever. Let me tell you, it's great stuff. It's all good.
Topwater sight fishing. I don't think there's anything better than that.
Absolutely. That's the name of the game.
All right, man. Well, listen, good luck with the rest of the season. I hope you catch a 55-incher and beat that 51. And call me when you do.
All right, Victor. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. And you have a great day.
You too. I'll talk to you later.
All right. See you, man. Bye-bye.